So welcome back. This next piece, if you recall the last couple of years, I've done a piece somewhere in the morning around sharing video clips from an interview that I did by Skype a couple of years ago with Professor Edgar Schein, and last year with Jordan Peterson. This year I had the pleasure of speaking. I met Professor Andrew Hopkins late last year working with a client in Aberdeen. He and I did a piece at the same workshop. So it was great to reconnect with him a few weeks ago by Skype. He was at his home office in Australia, and I was in Doha in Qatar at the time, and we just sat having a great chat while a professional camera crew captured what he had to say. And it's a great way to add in yet another expert into this conference. Let me show. So that's what he looks like, and he's as friendly as he looks, and as lovely and friendly as he looks. And those of you who recognize his name might remember that he's the author of a lot of papers and quite a number of books. These three really stand out in terms of relevance to our industry: Lessons from Longford, Failure to Learn, and Disastrous Decisions. So those books are quite well known in our industry, and he's quite well known as the author of them. And then this is his latest book, Organizing for Safety: How Structure Creates Culture. And I was quite interested and fascinated by the title. So one, organizing for safety, that sounds like something that's sensible to do, something worth doing, something we want to do. And then how structure creates culture made me go, we're gonna have to have a chat about that, and so you can tell me what you mean by that. And when I asked him, what do you mean by, when you say structure, what do you mean? And he said, well, in particular, I'm talking about organizational structure, hierarchies, positions, reporting lines, how decisions get made, who has the authority. That's in particular what I mean, he said, when I say structure. And of course, if you've been to this conference down through the years, and if you've been in safety conversations in your company, and you've been to safety trainings or safety leadership programs, or you're a member of a safety leadership team, any of that, you'll have been exposed many times to terms like mindset, culture, leadership, hearts and minds, what people would very often refer to as the softer side of safety. And Hopkins is talking about more like the harder side and how it creates culture. So getting the right structure in place and having that create culture. He also you'll see in the video clips as we show them, that he also talks about how they complement one another. Or kind of how you can't have one without the other. And he's a great guy for sharing examples from work that he's been directly involved in and things that he's studied closely, and for that matter, even clients that he's worked for. He's very generous about sharing that kind of thing, and again, you'll see that in the videos. And we'll move to the first clip, if we may, and if you could line it up. And in this first clip, he builds on the answer he gave me to what he means by structure. And he begins with a great example of the Columbia shuttle disaster, and what NASA discovered when they looked into that disaster. He also includes Deepwater Horizon as an example. And being a very fair-minded man, he'll also talk to us about the benefits and the drawbacks of having the kind of structure that he's talking about. So this is about a 10-minute video clip, and all of it's gold. So enjoy, and I'll come back to you when we run this clip. Thanks.
I think the best way to illustrate this point is with an example. And the example I want to use is the Columbia Space Shuttle accident. In 2003, that shuttle suffered a catastrophic accident, and all the astronauts on board were killed. What happened was that in the background, behind the shuttle, is a huge tank. It's an auxiliary tank. And pieces of cladding off that tank would fall off the tank and hit the shuttle on launch. And those pieces of cladding would dent the wings or the fuselage of the shuttle. Now, this shouldn't have happened. Something was wrong. But the organisation was intent on ignoring those things. It found a way to normalise them and say, well, this is not the way it should be, but this is a normal risk. This is not a risk we need to worry about. We can ignore this. Now, on the occasion in question, when the accident happened, a piece of that cladding fell off and hit the leading edge of one of those shuttle wings and created a hole in the edge. So that when the shuttle re-entered the atmosphere several days later, the atmosphere entered the hole and heated up very quickly and destroyed the shuttle. Now, the Accident Investigation Board that looked into this said the problem with NASA was that it had a broken safety culture, absolutely focused on launching on schedule, minimising cost, no matter what. This failure to deal adequately with anomalies, the normalisation of anomalies, these are very standard kinds of things that happen in organisations which are not dealing adequately with major hazard risk or process safety risk. So what was their solution to this? It was actually very interesting. It was that NASA needed to create a separate organisational focus within NASA, but completely outside of the shuttle launch operation. So it sits right outside the shuttle launch organisation and is not concerned with the concerns of the shuttle launches, namely schedule and cost. And it's called the Technical Engineering Authority. It has absolute control over certain matters, for example, whether to launch or not. It can veto a launch if it thinks the launch is not appropriate, and it can do so without regard to schedule or cost because it's not part of that launch organisation. So this is an example of a structural change, creating a node, if you like, a powerful organisational node within NASA, which had the capacity to override the daily operations of the launch organisation. And so by doing that, they created a culture which was much more focused on operational excellence, much more focused on risk, and much less focused on simply complying with schedule and minimising cost. So here's an example where the board made this recommendation because it could see that the only way to shift the culture of the organisation was to put in place that new organisational node, if you like. Let's try and apply this thinking to the oil and gas industry. To do this, I want to refer you to a diagram, and I want to talk about the way in which engineers perform and operate within a hazardous industry like the oil and gas industry. There are various ways in which they can relate to line management. On the left of those three is one way in which the engineers can relate. And you can see there's a CEO at the top, then there is a business unit leader, then a sub-business unit leader, and then an engineer. Now that's a very simplified diagram, obviously. But the point I want to make about that is this lowest level engineer is providing engineering services directly to a line manager. His performance agreement will be determined by that line manager. And that line manager is most interested in the commercial goals of the organisation. And the performance agreement will be designed around ensuring that the engineer is contributing to those commercial goals. And there will not be a focus on engineering excellence. There will be a focus on making that commercial contribution. And as far as the sub-business unit leader is concerned, he doesn't want a gold-plated engineering solution. He's happy with second best, provided it's good enough. And he will feel that these engineers are too focused on what they call gold-plated solutions. And over time, then the judgment of the engineer gets corrupted and co-opted in the service of the commercial goals of that line. So that's one model. Now, if you move to the middle model, you can see now that that engineer is still providing those engineering services via a dotted line to the line manager, but his performance agreement now is with a more senior engineer. And that means that's where his future lies. That's the person who's going to be determining his long-term career. And there will be therefore a greater focus on operational excellence and a greater insistence on the best possible engineering solutions. And the third diagram on the right is where you've got that engineering line running all the way to the CEO. And this is the best possible way of ensuring operational excellence in that organization. Now, the point about this is that the BP was operating in the Gulf of Mexico with the first of those models. Okay, it was, and the engineering which we saw in the Gulf of Mexico in the Macondo well was absolutely shoddy. One might use a worse adjective than that, but it certainly was shoddy. It was looking for anything will do almost was the attitude of the engineers. It's very disturbing. In fact, when you read the transcripts of what those engineers were thinking and doing, one ends up feeling very disturbed about how shoddy it was. It's easy to blame the engineers, but it's not their fault. They were victims of an organizational structure which was generating that kind of culture amongst them. What they did after that accident was to entirely redesign their organizational structure to deal with that problem. And they created engineering functional lines that run close to the top of the organization. But most importantly, they created a whole new function which they called the safety and operational risk function, which is a series of positions running from at the fairly low level in the organization right to the very top, answering directly to the CEO. So this was a powerful new function, and it had people in that function who were embedded in the various business units, so they were ensuring that those business units were complying with the highest appropriate engineering standards. And this was the way BP dealt with that problem. So this was a very clear recognition that they had got it wrong previously. They'd been operating a far too decentralised model, and they've moved to this other extreme, a much more centralised model, which is clearly a lot safer than they previously had. The critics of this model will tell you this is it's too rigid, it's too clunky, it makes it difficult to make decisions, and that may well be true. But that's the benefit. That's the benefit of the whole process. It means they've got to think twice. They've got to think carefully about what they're doing. They can't just disregard procedures or authorise deviations from procedures at a local level. They've got to go to a much higher level if they're going to authorise deviations from standards or procedures. This centralised risk function, in the way I've described, is not a foolproof system. It will not necessarily always achieve the outcome you want. So what are some of the reasons why it might fail? First and foremost, I think, is the incentive arrangements that are in place in the organisation. If you incentivise your risk function in terms of their contribution to annual profit of the organisation, then you're undermining their capacity to focus on risks which may culminate many years hence in a major accident. They can't focus on that if they're incentivised to maximise profit on an annual basis. And unfortunately, that is the case with some risk functions. We've seen it in the banking sector, that inappropriate financial incentives for the risk management function have undermined very seriously their capacity to manage financial risk. And it's true in the oil and gas industry as well. A second really important factor here is a very obvious one, is if you don't resource your risk function properly with competent people, then it's not going to work. You've got to resource these positions with very experienced high-level people who are in a position to argue with top executive management, argue the toss about the decisions that are being made. So that's the second thing. You've really got to have very competent people. There's a third factor here, and that is to do with the boards of these companies. The risk management function will work well if the board of the company wants it to work well. And in particular, if the board of the company reaches down and seeks to communicate with the risk function to understand what is going on and bypasses the CEO to access the risk function to see what is going on in the organisation. Unfortunately, too many boards are not willing to do that. They're not willing to communicate with people further down the organisation. They communicate only through the CEO, and that does not empower a risk function. That, I think, is a really important lesson for hazardous industries in general and for the oil and gas industry in particular.
Okay, so a couple of great examples and some interesting stuff for us to think about in terms of structure, benefits and drawbacks, if you will. As part of our conversation, we got into talking about investigations and the lessons learned and Professor Hopkins' lessons, having studied a lot of cases, written a lot of case studies, and also been involved directly in quite a few accident investigations himself. Again, he starts this next clip that we'll show with a great example. This time the example comes from the mining industry. He works across a number of industries, including oil and gas, but not limited to that. So this particular example that he starts with is from mining, and he also goes on to talk to us about the Australian Air Force, who he worked with, and the difference in safety between ground maintenance crews and people in the air, and why he believes that was the case. And in here, he's really talking to us about authority to act and decide, and who has it. So let's take a look at the clip.
I get asked from time to time by big companies to participate in their own internal accident investigations, and one I was involved with was a company which was a metalliferous mining company, big international metalliferous mining company. And the way they were mining was cavern mining. They were creating huge underground caverns, which they would later fill in. Creating these caverns was safe, provided they were not too closely spaced. They would support themselves for a period of time, provided they were not too closely spaced. Unfortunately, the company was, as they progressed through the rocks, their caverns were becoming closer and closer together, which meant that these caverns were more and more precarious. And their geotechnical technician was concerned. He said, "This is now becoming dangerous. I'm not sure that this is the best way to go." He raised this with his superiors, but they ignored him because he didn't have any clear, irrefutable evidence that this was the case, and so he ended up shutting up. And the result of this was, indeed, they had a major collapse. There were no fatalities or injuries, and that was very lucky because there was nobody there when this whole cavern collapsed. There could have been, and there could have been fatalities. But the whole process came to a standstill for months. Now, the point I made in the inquiry, the internal inquiry, was that this geotechnical technician was far too low in the pecking order. If he'd been 2 or 3 steps further up the line, even though he was responding on the basis of a gut feeling, as it were, without the clearest of numerical or quantitative rationales, his view would have been respected as an expert at a higher level in the company. But because he was low level, he was too easily dismissed. And this is a theme I see over and over again, that the risk experts who can't necessarily back up what they're saying with absolutely quantitative arguments, but who nevertheless have long experience in this field and whose judgment should not be disregarded, those people are not sufficiently high in the hierarchy to be able to carry the day. Another example that I found very interesting was working with the Australian Air Force. They had discovered that they were putting the health of their maintenance workers, their ground-based maintenance workers, at risk. In fact, hundreds and hundreds of them suffered serious health consequences from working with toxic chemicals, and the Air Force had not dealt properly with this issue. And one can say that their safety programs in relation to ground maintenance were seriously inadequate. And we were called in to investigate why. And what we discovered in our inquiry was that while the ground safety maintenance or processes were inadequate, air safety, the safety of the aviators and the safety of the aircraft, was very well handled and was of a very high standard. And so we asked ourselves, why the difference? And the answer turned out to be to do with the organisational structure within the Air Force. There was another one of these organisational nodes with a dedicated focus on aviation safety, headed by a very senior Air Force general. And because of the seniority of his position, his organisation was extremely powerful in ensuring that the aviators were well looked after and that the aircraft were well looked after. But there was no similar powerful organisational structure attending to the welfare, the safety of the ground workers, not just the maintenance workers, but other ground workers within the Air Force. And so we had this fascinating contrast between these two cases, one where there was a powerful node, organisational node, which had this amazing effect in terms of the safety of the aircraft, and the other area where there was no such organisational node with those consequences I've mentioned.
Okay. How are we doing so far? How are we doing so far? Oh, there we go. Okay, good. It's a lonely spot up here, you know. We got into talking about approaches other than how structures create culture. What other approaches are there? Complementary or alternative? Well, we're going to be talking other approaches. And this particular piece of the conversation reminded me of a presentation that I was lucky enough to be at a Shell meeting in the middle of last year, where Paul O'Neill, who was the CEO of Alcoa, and turned that company around during his time as CEO in the most remarkable way. And depending on which story you read or what way it's presented, very often the story is presented as a kind of legendary safety leadership story where he put safety first, and it was no kidding, it was first. And many who write about it or talk about it would say, well, that's what turned the company around, was putting safety first. When O'Neill gets in a room full of people and shares his story, he starts talking about turning the company around through habitual excellence, including the approach to safety, including the results they were looking for in safety. But he was also looking for, in this particular talk, he says, getting your financial reporting done within 2.5 days of the end of the month, bang, done, reported to Wall Street. That's habitual excellence, not the 12 days it was taking, but getting it done because that's what's excellent, and approaching safety in a particular way because that's what's excellent. So it wasn't just safety. And so it's not just one kind of approach that'll get you there. We know this, right? In a world of complexity, one approach won't get us there. It's a combination. So I asked him about, what about other approaches? What about other things that go with this or go against this? Or I wanted to know about other approaches and what he had to say. So here's what he says.
One of the main alternative views as to how you create the change cultures in organizations is to run educational campaigns within the organization, often described as hearts and minds campaigns, trying to win the hearts and minds of your employees, win them over to a different way of thinking, a different way of behaving. Shell is a very good example. The petroleum company Shell is well known for its own hearts and minds campaign, which it ran for some years, a few years ago. And it was a very well-resourced campaign. They ran all of their employees, tens of thousands of their employees, through their Hearts and Minds campaign. And one of the dominant images in this campaign is the safety maturity ladder. And the idea here was to train people to think that there are different levels at which an organization can operate. At the lowest level, you've got pathological organizational culture. I won't run up the steps of the ladder, but at the top level, you have a generative organizational culture. I won't try and define these terms. But the whole aim of Shell's Hearts and Minds campaign was to get people to think in terms of this organizational maturity ladder and think about ways in which they might move the organization up that ladder. Now, the designer of this campaign, a guy by the name of Patrick Hudson, wrote an article some years later saying it really hadn't had the effect he had hoped it would have. People could all talk in terms of pathological organizations, and they could talk about generative organizations, but behavior hadn't really changed. And the reason he gave as to why it hadn't changed is because the organization hadn't made the kinds of organizational changes which would be necessary to cement that new culture into place. And he ended up being quite pessimistic about the outcome of that campaign. One of the things about a generative safety culture is that people will report all kinds of things. That's the aim, to get people to report. But reporting will only work and only has the kind of effect that you want it to have if the organisation is receptive to those reports and has systems to receive and act on those reports. That's quite a big organisational demand that is made on the organisation. And if it doesn't respond to that demand, people who are making reports find that their reports disappear into a black box and are rapidly disillusioned by the whole process. And that's why I say that a Hearts and Minds campaign, it's all very well, but unless it's supported by a really powerful organisational change, it's just not going to work.
Point well made. Point well made. Thinking about, or not thinking about, but referring back to the Piper Alpha dramatizations earlier on, and to Charlie's very personal story. Part of the conversation with Professor Hopkins was about reporting, risk normalization, somebody worrying but not saying what they really felt. I mentioned to him, things like, all the dashboards are green, isn't that great? And why isn't somebody saying, where's the red stuff on the dashboards? There must be something red, right? Like I remember witnessing a conversation between two senior managers from the oil and gas industry, and one was talking about basically green dashboards, and it was fabulous. Everything was superb. And the guy sitting next to him said, "Have you forgotten that you took over that place from me 9 months ago? Are you telling me you fixed everything? Because that ain't what the dashboards looked like when I was there. Seriously, it wasn't what they looked like." So we were having a conversation of that nature. So listen out for risk normalization, reporting, and so on in this next piece by Professor Hopkins.
It's not enough for management to say, we want you to report the bad news. The question is, how is that bad news received? And the way in which it needs to be received is with celebration, this is the word I would use. We need to celebrate when people report bad news. Let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. There's a very famous case in the literature of this is on a US nuclear aircraft carrier. And a worker thought he might have left a tool on the deck of the aircraft carrier. Very dangerous thing to do, obviously. So he reported this to the commanding officer of the aircraft carrier, that he couldn't find the tool that might be on the deck of the aircraft carrier. So essentially he's reporting not only something that was dangerous, but was something which arguably was his fault. He nevertheless went ahead and reported it. Yes, there were aircraft in the sky at the time. They had to be diverted to a shore base. Finally, the tool was found and the aircraft were brought back on board. So a big disruption to the activities of the aircraft carrier. The next day, the commanding officer of the carrier summoned the crew to the deck and held a small ceremony where he congratulated that man for having made that report, celebrated the fact that that man had made that report in the courageous way that he had made it. So this is what I mean by celebrating and encouraging. Now let me give you some examples from the oil and gas industry, because there are some fabulous examples in the oil and gas industry. I was sitting in the office of a senior manager one day, and she was embarked on a campaign of getting the bad news reported in her organisation. She was on the phone to a subordinate who had written her a report, and the report was full of good news. So she was on the phone, she said to him, "Thank you for the report and thank you for the good news, but where is the bad news? Please rewrite your report to include the bad news." And that's what is necessary. That's what managers need to do if they are serious about getting these reports. Now, she went a step further, and in a wonderful way. She was willing to give awards to people who provided her with information, important information in relation to process safety matters that were worrying to people. And she had a whole scale of awards. The top level of award was a platinum award, which was worth $1,000. Then there was gold, then there was silver. And at the time I was there, she'd just made a platinum award to an operator who had noticed that the safe operating limits on his piece of equipment had been changed without going through the necessary management of change process. And he was disturbed by this, and he wrote an email to his boss, and that email went up the line and arrived on the screen of the manager who I was talking to. And she was so impressed by this, and this was such a valuable report as far as she was concerned, that she gave this guy a platinum award worth $1,000. Now, you can really understand how this works, because if that message gets around very, very quickly, that we have a boss who is rewarding people for making useful, and that's a very important word, useful process safety reports. And the question is then, what is the most useful? What is it that she's responded to? People are quickly attuned to what it is that is getting the kind of reward that she's offering. So it's a way of focusing everyone's attention on the things that are most useful to report in that organisation. It's encouraging an awareness of risk, a mindfulness about risk, which was previously not there. So many managers will say, well, we want our people to report, but they never do. And the question is, why don't they? It's either because they're getting negative responses or they're getting a blank response. And what you need is a very positive response that tells you, thank you, you've done absolutely the right thing, we appreciate that. So the most powerful thing that a risk function can do is ensure that those mechanisms for reporting of bad news are working well, that bad news is getting to the top of the organisation and being responded to. The risk function, the safety function within air traffic control in Australia had a reporting system, and I came across a report that while I was studying them, it came from the Air Traffic Control Centre at Adelaide. They made a report at the end of the night shift. The night shift had been short-staffed. They'd been down by one air traffic controller, and they couldn't get a replacement. The result of that was that they were not working in as low-risk a way as they would like to have. Nothing went wrong that night, but this was not the ideal situation as far as the other air traffic controllers were concerned. So they reported this into their incident reporting system. The first comment I want to make about this is it's very unusual for people to report issues about fatigue or understaffing into risk management systems, but they are certainly the kinds of things which need to be reported in a major hazard industry. And so they made this report. It went through that night. The next morning, it's electronically received at head office in Canberra. These reports are analysed by expert staff. They identify which are the most significant, and the head risk manager for the organisation reports on these particular incidents, the ones that have been judged most important, to a 8 a.m. meeting of the executive of that, the top executive of that organisation. So this report about understaffing was considered by the senior executive of this organisation within hours of the report having been made. Now that's an example of what an organisation which is really serious about accessing bad news does. It's an example of how it sets up a function, a risk function, which will ensure that that kind of information gets to the top.
Okay, we're going well. We've 2 more clips to share with you. Just before I set up the next clip, really appreciate the questions that are coming in and the building of the word cloud. Just encourage you to keep your questions coming, keep your words coming for the word cloud. Really, really appreciate it. One of the things that I wanted to put to Andrew, and that he was quite happy for me to put to him, was that in our conversation and thinking about structure creates culture, that some of what he talks about sounds like it's at odds with, for example, the work of Sidney Dekker, who was here last year and showed us the example of the procedure. He'd been offshore and someone was holding a procedure, 30-page procedure for a simple task, and he called it madness. Right, and I said, well, some of what you're talking about, you know, around structure, rules, authority, regulation, it sounds like it's at odds with, for example, the work of Sidney Dekker. What would you say about that? And here's what he had to say about that.
Well, I've thought a lot about Sidney Dekker's arguments, because I have a lot of respect for Sidney Dekker, and so let me give you the benefit of what I've been thinking about. First of all, his concept is safety anarchism. It's a very important term. Anarchism is the idea that we don't need rules and regulations, and in this case we don't need rules and regulations to pursue safety, that it's better left to the attitudes and concerns of workers themselves, their own motivations. If you leave it to them, they know what's best and they will do what is best. The question is, how far can we extend that idea? And Dekker is very clear that there are limits to how far you can extend that idea. One domain, for example, that it does not apply to is aircraft safety. And he's very clear about that. Dekker is an aircraft pilot, and he says at one point, look, if you're a pilot, you just have to follow the checklist. There's no way around it. You follow the checklist, because if you don't, you're going to confuse your co-pilot and you're much more likely to end up in a disastrous situation. So you just follow the checklist as it's provided to you. So it's clear he doesn't want to generalise to every other environment necessarily. And if we come to the oil and gas industry, and particularly in relation to process safety, this is certainly an environment where we don't want to generalise. We don't want to apply anarchistic principles in this environment, because there are so many rules and regulations, limits, engineering limits which apply in the oil and gas arena, which workers really have no understanding of why those limits are there, but they're very important limits. They've been devised by engineers, and it's really important that they be complied with. So this is an environment where that notion of safety anarchism cannot and must not be applied. Now, it's very important to say this, because I've come across a number of senior managers in the oil and gas industry who were really excited by Dekker's ideas. And they're wondering, can this be applied in the oil and gas industry? And my answer is no, for the reasons I've given to you. And when I visit these sites, these companies, the process safety engineering folk are deeply worried by the fact that their senior managers are playing with these ideas. And I want to say to them, well, look, that's not what Becker's intention was, and it's simply dangerous to think that you can apply those ideas holus bolus in that kind of environment.
Okay, so an interesting alternative view, complementary and alternative, I guess you could say. Final clip, and finally I asked him, look, from the knowing the audience, because he has presented here at this conference before on stage, and you know, sharing with him, reminding him the makeup of the audience and the setting and so on. I just asked him, from the books that you've written, from the work that you've done down through the years, and for this particular presentation that we're making together, what are the few key points that you would want people to walk out of the auditorium with? If you could summarize what the key points are, that the things that you want people left with. And here is what he had to say about that.
Well, the key themes from all of those books that I've written, which are relevant to people at all levels of the organisation, I can think of a few. The first is that prior to any major accident, there are warning signs that something is amiss, which are ignored, and had they been picked up and responded to, the accident wouldn't have occurred. So the first message here is be alert to anomalies, things that are not the way they should be, and don't pass over them. Report them to higher levels of the organisation. Put up your hand and say things are not right here in the way that they should be. That's the first lesson, I think, that's applicable for people at all levels of the organisation. A second one might well be that if you encounter a problem which you'd like to be able to solve for yourself, but you can't solve it, don't persist with trying to solve it on the assumption that it is your responsibility to solve it. Escalate it. There are many people at higher levels in the organisation whose job it is to deal with tricky problems. So if you're confronting a tricky problem, escalate it to higher levels of the organisation. I think a third lesson is around compliance with procedures. In hazardous industries, it's very important to comply with procedures. But often, or at least sometimes, those procedures are inappropriate. And what workers will often do in that situation is to find their own workarounds. Now, that's not the best way to behave. What we want is for our workforce to engage in what I would call mindful compliance. And that means that you're complying with procedures, you are aware at all times, are these procedures working or are they not? Are they, for some reason, inappropriate in this situation? And if the procedures are not appropriate, you don't simply develop your own workaround. You put up your hand and say to those higher in the organisation, these procedures are not working. What do you want us to do about them? So I think if those simple rules were followed, a lot of the difficulties, a lot of the problems which organisations have got themselves into would disappear. In this present book, which is focused on organisational structure at the highest level, there's far less ways in which those ideas can be immediately applied by people at lower levels of the organisation. But I think the big benefit for people further down the organisation is to understand why it is that these organisations are so resistant, it's so difficult to get things to change. And the answer is because of the nature of the organisational structure, because of the nature of the bonus arrangements that are in place. Once people further down the organisation understand this and get that clarity, I think it's personally empowering to them to have this realisation, to have this understanding. What I would hope is that they have an aha moment. Aha, now I understand why things are the way they are. So what would I like you, the audience, to take away from this? I think the first thing is this, that in truly safety-conscious organisations, they are organised to access the bad news and to transmit it up the organisation to a place where it can be acted on in some kind of conscientious way. It is quite remarkable how conscientiously they do that and how much they mine that information for whatever nuggets of preventive gold there may be in that information. So that's the first thing, the vital importance of accessing the bad news, not sweeping it under the carpet, getting what you can from it. And the second is to go back to these fundamental root causes which seem to lie behind every major accident. That is the way in which incentive arrangements can undermine a focus on safety and prioritise a focus on profit. You see that over and over again. It's something to be guarded against. It's something to be alert to. The other factor that I've really emphasised is the importance of organisational structure, and in the oil and gas industry, the way a decentralised organisational structure allows every sub-business unit to pursue its own agendas, its own profit-maximising agendas, which can be at the expense of process safety. And the only real way around this is to centralise control over those matters. And that's, I think, a lesson that I would really seek to leave with you.
Okay. While one of the video clips was on, I took a photograph of him on screen and sent him an email saying, "Your videos are on in Esbjerg in Denmark, thanks again." So he knows we were watching just now.